Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
All right, thank you so much. Our time is 15:30. I wish to request that we give colleagues that may be trying to log into our meeting some 5 more minutes. So meaning we'll start our meeting at 15:35. So just bear with us for some next 5 minutes so that others may join in. At least today our presenter is in already, so it's just some of your colleagues that we are trying to give a few more minutes before we can commence the meeting. Thank you. Good afternoon once more. I wish to welcome you all to this examination answering techniques meeting for our auditing papers. So, as you may be aware, the two papers do have a lot in common. However, they have their points at which they depart in terms of the items in common. And so you will note that as our presenter for the day will be giving us his presentation, he will touch more on areas that are common between the two subjects. So we implore you to pay attention so that you learn something. You learn something from what has been noted, for instance, as one of the causes for poor performance among those of your colleagues that have written this paper before. And it is our hope that once you learn this, you'll be able to apply yourself fully to the coming session, which is the June session. As you may be aware, you have just slightly over a week remaining before you write this paper. So please pay attention. Our presenter for the day is a very much experienced examiner in this area with vast experience both in practice as well as in academia. In your ear, Mr. Sylvester, could you please mute your mic? And so with those remarks, I hand over to Mr. Mumbuluma. Perhaps one announcement before Mr. Mumbuluma takes over. Please note that this meeting's recording shall be shared with you. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Mumbuluma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katungu, for the kind introduction. Welcome, colleagues, to this meeting, examination techniques meetings for CA2.3&DA11, and with emphasis on DA11, where the performance was quite bad in the last March 2025 examinations. And so I do hope and trust that at the end of it all, we'll benefit something to be able and increase our chances of passing this exam. At this stage, where we have only 10 days to go before the exams, it is assumed that at least we would have learned we've done all the studying, and now it's basically preparing to sit for the exam. And the aim of this meeting obviously be to help you and increase your chances of passing this exam. And so we'll go through the slides, I think in the first 1 hour, after which I will give you a chance or an opportunity to give feedback and ask any questions that you might have.
We have lost you, Mr. Mumbuluma. Try to unmute yourself.
Yes, there's a small technical hitch. The slide is not moving. We're trying to resolve it. Thanks. All right, thank you. We are on now. Okay. So if we go to the slide that is on the screen now, we have the objectives of the meeting, and you know, is the first presentation, and then we'll look at the syllabus for both papers, CA2.3 and DA11, and then the structure of the exam, the learning outcomes, the general matters related to CA2.3 and the DA11 principles of auditing, and we'll consider how to pass the exam, and then we'll look at assurance engagements in brief, elements of an assurance engagement, the main stages of assurance engagements, and common causes, with emphasis on common causes of examination failure in these two papers, and then the presentation of examination solutions in certain specified topics, and tips on answering scenario risk identification questions, one of the important areas of the syllabus, answering ethical identification questions, again, another important area of the syllabus, answering review and report questions, and then we'll review the March 2025 examination DA11. Because of the poor performance, I thought it is important and necessary that we look at the paper and see whether or not it was a very challenging paper or it is within the standard of this particular examination. Then we'll consider the examination technique, and we'll interact where you ask questions and we'll try and answer those questions. So please, let's listen attentively. And so the objective of this meeting is to give you, the candidates, an opportunity to interact with us who are the experts in these different fields, so that we clarify areas that may be of concern regarding the examinations to you. And then, of course, to appraise candidates on the main causes of poor performance, the results for the CA2.3 and DA11 examinations, and to highlight the main problems encountered by candidates in certain specified syllabus areas, and then to discuss the examination technique that could increase the candidates' chances of passing the exam, both CA2.3 and DA11, and of course to respond to any questions that may be of concern. In terms of the syllabus and syllabus weightings, it's very important that as students intending to sit for these exams, we are very clear of what we are preparing for. And you will notice, actually, as Mr. Gatungu introduced earlier on, these papers are exactly more 90% the same. It's the same syllabus, except the structure of the exam is different between the two papers. But in terms of syllabus weightings, you will note that for CA2.3, there are 5 main areas of the syllabus, and all of them have a weighting of 20%. And what that means is each of the syllabus areas has got a maximum of 24 marks out of the 120 marks in an examination paper that can be examined. And it's important that we know what this means, which means of the 120 marks, 24 marks will come from the first unit, which is purpose and context of an audit, whereas 24 marks will come from corporate governance and so on. In terms of DA11, the paper's got, 8 units, and the percentages is given. The first unit is with a 5% weighting, the purpose and context of audit. So in an ideal examination paper, only 6 marks will come from that particular area. Corporate governance has got 10%, which is 12 marks out of the 125 marks, and so on. And you will note topics like internal controls has got 20 marks of the total marks, which means 25 out of 125 marks will be on internal control. That gives you an idea of how important each of these areas are. And you will notice, going by this, it means you cannot actually do selective studying, because each of these topics should be examined to the extent of the weightings that are given here. So basically the topics are the same for both papers, except for the weightings and the structure of the examination. Now, in terms of the structure, for 2.3, you've got 1 compulsory question of 40 marks and 4 optional questions, out of which students are expected to attempt any 3 questions of 20 marks each. Whereas the diploma paper has got 2 compulsory questions of 25 marks, giving a total of 50 compulsory marks, and 3 optional questions, out of which candidates are required to attempt any 2 questions, and to give us a total of 120 and 125 marks respectively. Now, the learning outcomes are very important for candidates to be aware. What are these learning outcomes? It's what you are expected to be able to demonstrate that you understand after passing through, after studying this paper, and after passing this particular exam. So we'll look at the learning outcomes for both papers quickly, CA2.3 and DA11. And you can see from the screen there that most of the items or most of the outcomes here require candidates to explain issues. So it's basically explain, 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 and to a limited extent, evaluate, such as in the case of internal controls. And this is basically a lower level of administering or examining where candidates are required to explain. And so you need to understand the topics in such a way that you'll be able to explain what the examiner would want you to actually examine. So it's basically limited evaluation and reporting is shown there. These are clearly shown or given in the study manual or in the student handbook. So please, we need to make sure we understand what the learning outcomes are. For the DA11, again, you can see it's basically you're required to explain, demonstrate to a limited extent, and evaluate. And when you compare for CA2.3,
I live in Pekon.
Okay. Someone requests to mute it.
Mr. Mumbuluma, we've lost your audio.
Okay. I was saying the learning outcomes for DA11 also require candidates to explain matters rather than evaluate. There's limited evaluation and identification. So again, please, we need to make sure we understand what these learning outcomes are. And these are what you are required to demonstrate in the examination. You should be able to explain. Most of the questions will require you to explain and to identify and to a limited extent to evaluate matters in the exam. And so the general matters related to these two papers basically is how can you increase your chances of passing the exam, and is there any prior knowledge that is required before you can take this exam, and we'll look at the verbs that are used in examination questions. Now, the pass mark for both papers is 50 out of 100 marks. Okay, it's 50 out of 100 marks, which means in theory, you must get 50% of the marks in each of the 4 questions that you attempt. For the CA2.3, you must get a minimum of 20 marks for the compulsory question and 10 marks each in the optional questions to give you the required 50% to pass the examination. In the case of DA11, you are expected or required to score at least 12.5 marks in each of the 4 questions. Of course, the compulsory questions, which means 25 marks for the compulsory questions, because those you are required to attempt, and then you can get the 50 marks. Although in reality, you may not get scores as given above, you may get more marks in the compulsory questions and maybe less marks in the optional questions, but that should be your focus, that should be your aim, which means it must be clear from this slide that if you don't attempt a question, then you reduce your chances of scoring the 50 marks that are required for you to pass the examination. Okay. In terms of prior knowledge required to take this exam, it's basically communication skills, being able to write clearly for the examiner to award you marks. Remember, this is a largely theory paper, and so communication skills are very, very important. You should write what makes sense. If it doesn't make sense to you, then most likely it will not make sense to the examiner. And so we must use our words carefully, and we must use the auditing language that we learn in these particular courses, you see. And there's also need to have good knowledge of financial reporting and accounting standards. That is why these papers, the auditing papers, are preceded by financial reporting papers. It is assumed that candidates have a good understanding of financial reporting and also the accounting standards that are used in financial reporting. And the reason is simple. You can't audit something that you do not understand. Remember, the auditing focuses on the financial statements. And so you can only design or suggest suitable procedures if you know the financial reporting aspects. In terms of work experience, it's not mandatory, but those who have got practical work experience can use that as an advantage, because most of what is learned in these papers is practical, is what actually goes on in the workplace. We are talking about the goods received notes, the segregation of duties, internal controls, and so on, the actual things that happen in the workplace. So that can give you an added advantage. Provisions of accounting standards, I think we've already mentioned that we need to be clear on the accounting standards. And the good thing is, it's not all accounting standards. The syllabus clearly specifies which accounting standards we need to have an understanding of. And so, even at this stage, when we have 10 days to go, if you're not sure about specific accounting issues, you are encouraged or advised to go through, get an old financial reporting manual, and just make sure that you understand those. In terms of tools that you require to prepare for the exam, is basically the student handbook, so that you know the syllabus, then the study manual, of course, and the revision kit. And if you're able to, and you can get it on the internet, the Accountants Act of 2008. In terms of the verbs that are used in the exam, like we saw when we are looking at the learning outcomes, is basically to explain matters. It's the most common verb used. If you look at any first exam paper, you'll find a lot of explanation to be made, and you can only explain things that you don't understand. So if you don't understand, you are unlikely to explain adequately on issues that you are required to do so. And then, of course, there is evaluation, particularly in terms of the topic on internal controls. You are expected to evaluate and then apply procedures, in other words, design procedures for particular assertions in the financial statements. What are the audit procedures you need to perform, for example, on receivables and so on? And then report appropriately on audit and assurance. In other words, we should know the guidance on audit reporting and the relevant auditing standards that give guidance in the various areas of audit reporting. Okay. Now, how to pass the exam? I picked this actually directly from the study manual, and I thought it's important that we understand and we know what is said based on page 15 of the study manual. Okay. The first point that is clearly explained there is that we should study the whole syllabus without exception. And that is the whole idea. You cannot have half-baked accountants who know only specific areas. What makes an exam is that you don't know what the examiner will bring in or will bring in the examination. But for all we know, the examiner is guided by the syllabus weightings, which means they will bring topics from all the syllabus areas. So it doesn't work. Even if you think there are certain topics that are preferred, that may just be by chance. And therefore, we should not be selective in terms of studying. Then the next point, it talks of lots of question practice. I think that is what is lacking in most students, and that is evidenced by the answers that are shown in the exam. And therefore, you can only develop application skills by attempting the questions in the chapter in the study manual, and also practice questions with those that are in the revision kit, and also past examination questions. Even reading the questions and answers will also help you to see how you're supposed to answer these exams. You just go on a program of reading 4 exam standard questions and read the answers and think about the connection, the link between them. That will help you in passing the exam. It says analyzing questions. This is a very, very important point. You need to consider the question requirements carefully. It's very common for students to start setting their own questions. You don't understand the question and you give a correct answer to a question that has not been asked. And no marks are awarded, not a single mark, even for a correct answer to a question not asked will not earn you any marks. If the question requires you to explain, make sure that you explain rather than just produce a bullet point. You have to explain, which means somebody should be able to understand. You cannot hide by being too brief. Okay? When answering questions, you need to ensure that you use the relevant information in the scenario. And that's what makes this exam quite interesting. Because usually when you're required to use the information in the scenario, the answers are in the scenario. If you studied your syllabus carefully, you'll be able to see the answers in the scenario. So try by all means to use the information in the scenario, use the names of the people in the scenario, the names of companies or entities in the scenario. Well-judged, clear answers grounded in the scenario always give markers. It says well-judged, clear answers grounded in the scenario always score well, as markers for the paper have a wide remit to reward good answers. What does that mean? This is a theory paper. You can have two students scoring the same score, maybe 55 and so on, but with different answers because it is theory. So your explanations will help you gain marks. Try and support your answer, and then the markers have a wide remit. They can award you marks as long as you are technically correct. Are we together, colleagues? And so what is auditing? I thought we should also look at the paper generally. What is auditing? It's basically assurance. And I must add early in the presentation that this thing is all one thing in terms of giving assurance. The only thing that they've done in the syllabus is to put it into separate sections, planning the audit, conducting the audit, and then the review. But the whole objective is to give assurance to people who are not involved in running the entity. And how is that? There's separation of ownership and management, whereby for large corporations, the shareholders who own the companies do not take part in the day-to-day running of the company. Management are employees who run the company on behalf of the shareholders, and they prepare, or they are required to prepare, financial statements which are supposed to be presented to management. It is this separation that requires, that demands that actually an audit should be conducted. How do the shareholders confirm that actually management has fulfilled their responsibility correctly in running the company? So it's about stewardship. The management are stewards, they are agents of the shareholders. And it's about corporate governance. How well are they running the company? And we must be aware also that management is supervised by boards of directors who are acting again on behalf of the shareholders. So the board of directors helps the shareholders by ensuring that the management perform their stewardship role correctly. And then the objective, obviously, is for the auditor to form an opinion after the audit and communicate that opinion through the audit report. We'll look at the appointment of the auditor and the ethical requirements. Also, it's important we know how do auditors get appointed. In case you at some stage decide to be an auditor and you are given a practicing license to practice as an auditor, there are ethical requirements in terms of how you can be appointed. And that's why we are learning them. You cannot just accept appointment. You have to follow through certain ethical requirements and the ethical professional ethics that you are expected to maintain as accountants for that matter. We'll look at internal audit briefly and also how auditors can rely on the work of internal audit. In terms of the elements of an assurance engagement, what is this whole issue of audit? It has got basically 5 elements. It has got 5 elements. We know the mnemonic crest. Okay, if I may try to use logic here, what we are saying is at the center of this assurance engagement, there are 3 parties here. There's the client, there's the shareholders, and then there are the auditors. That's what it is. There are 3, it's a 3-party relationship. And what is at the center of this 3-party relationship is the financial statements, which is the subject matter. It's the financial statements prepared by management showing how the entity has been operating. And what about these financial statements, whether or not they've been prepared in accordance with the given criteria, in this case, the accounting standards or whatever regulations that may apply. And then the auditors obviously will require to obtain evidence by performing audit procedures and then evaluate that evidence and issue a report which will contain the audit opinion. So the need for an audit is basically because of that separation of ownership and management. So the main stages of this assurance engagement, the main stage of auditors conducting an audit starts with appointment. Auditors have to be appointed. Then after being appointed, they will plan the audit. When you go out to conduct an audit at the end of the year, you have to plan the audit before you commence doing the detailed work. And then after planning the audit, you perform the audit procedures and then, of course, evaluate internal controls and decide on whether or not you would want to rely on the effectiveness of audit internal controls. and then perform substantive audit procedures. And then finally, the auditors will require to review towards the end of the audit, to review the work that has been done and perform finalization procedures, and then issue a report which will contain the audit opinion. Now, just to give you a brief understanding of what actually happens at the year end, let us assume the year end of a client is 31st December 2024, and the auditors go in to conduct an audit. The client will provide the auditors with a trial balance. We know this from financial reporting, with a trial balance and the general ledger. The general ledger is from where the trial balance is extracted. So the auditors will be given this information, and then there will be, the general ledger will contain details of the balances or transactions for each item in the financial statements. For the statement of financial position, for the balance sheet, what we used to call the balance sheet, the client will require to give the auditors schedules or details of what makes up those figures. Remember, the statement of financial position is at the end of the year end. So the general ledger will not in itself give you what makes up those figures. So the client will give the auditors schedules giving a breakdown of receivables, a breakdown of payables, a breakdown of the bank balance, and so on, and all the figures in the statement of financial position. And so the auditors then will extract samples for testing. Remember, auditors cannot and do not test all transactions and balances because audits will take much longer and also will be very expensive. And so they will extract samples on which they will perform audit procedures and conclude on the whole population. So it's important for candidates to have knowledge of structure of audit firms as well and the composition of a typical audit team. What I'm saying there is we must be aware, because in the exam, you'll be told you are a partner, you are a manager, you are an audit senior. Let us have a good idea or understanding of the structure of a typical audit firm. There will normally be a senior partner, then there will be other partners, and then you have the audit managers, and then the audit seniors and audit assistants. So audit teams are composed of at least one engagement partner, and maybe an audit manager, an audit senior, and several audit assistants. It's important because you will find these terms in the exam, so we need to know that. Okay, and so in terms of appointment of auditors, there are preconditions that are required to be met, meaning if these preconditions are not met, then the auditors should not what? Should not accept appointment. Let's be very, very clear again in terms of the use of the terms decline or resign. So when you are being appointed auditors for the first time and the preconditions do not exist, then the auditors should decline the appointment. They should say, no, we cannot be your auditors. We should know what the preconditions are. Obviously, that management acknowledges its responsibilities for the preparation of financial statements, and that they will also give the auditors all the information that they require. So if the management does not acknowledge this, there's no point in going ahead with the audit when you know very well that they will not give you all the information that you require for you to be able to form an opinion. Quite important. Let's be aware also in terms of continuous, what happens once you are appointed as auditors. These are not indefinite. If you have been appointed to be auditors for the next 5 years, on an annual basis, you must evaluate whether or not you want to continue being auditors. Again, the standards give guidance on what you need to consider. We must be aware of that. Are we together? Very, very important. Another important thing to remember in terms of appointment is what matters to consider in bidding for audit services. Let us say a client advertises that they require audit services. What matters will the firm consider before deciding bidding? They will consider matters such as, do they have the experience? Do they have the time to do the audit? Do they have the skills? Do they have the money to be able to undertake that audit? If they don't, then most likely they will say they will not even bid to be appointed as auditors. Then once you decide to bid, and then the client approaches you and says, we want you to be our auditors, it means they are offering you the opportunity to either accept or reject appointment. So at that stage, it is up to the auditors to accept appointment or reject appointment. Again, they will need to consider ethical issues and whether they're actually able to do the audit before accepting appointment. Exam questions will be very clear, categorical on what you are required to explain, whether it is at the stage of bidding or it's at the stage of accepting nomination. What matters should you consider? We must be very clear in terms of the removal of auditors. clients cannot just chase away or remove auditors. There are procedures that must be followed, and we must know those. We must know the procedures for resignation, which means if in the exam you are given information and the auditors were removed in an irregular manner, you must be able to say this was not correct, what should have been done is this and so on. You must know what the procedure for auditors in terms of resigning it should be. They cannot just leave an audit client. There are procedures to be followed. Let's make sure we know what those procedures are. And then obviously, once we have been appointed, the auditors will submit an engagement letter. Very important to know, this is basically the contract between the auditors and the client. And we must know the contents of the engagement letter, what is included in the engagement letter, and also where there's need to change the terms of the engagement. In other words, usually the engagement letter is done once, and once that is done, the auditors may use the same engagement letter for a number of years. But if circumstances require, for instance, there's a total change of management or the scope of the work has changed, the auditors may wish to change the contents of the engagement letter. So we must be able, from given information, to explain when there's need to change the contents of an engagement letter. Okay. In terms of planning the audit, a few points that are important to note there, planning the audit. This is in accordance with ISA 315, a very important auditing standards, identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. And in understanding these standards, we must be able to answer three critical questions. Why are we doing it? What is it that we need to gain an understanding of? And how do we gain an understanding of it? Of the entity. Basically, the whole objective of the performing risk assessment is for the auditors at the planning stage to identify areas where things could go wrong in the financial statements, to identify where financial statements are likely to be misstated. Why? So that the auditors can place emphasis on the risk areas, to exert their effort, their audit effort on the riskier areas. Because remember, time is a factor. The client may be wanting the audit to be finalized within a very, very short period of time. And so we identify risks and what could cause the financial statements to be misstated. And in doing so, we must identify both audit risk and business risk. Very, very important. This is another area where students have challenges. The examiner will ask you explain 5 audit risks, and then you explain 5 business risks. The examiner may put a combination of both audit and business risks. You are required, you need to know the difference between them. If they ask you for business risks, then do not explain audit risks. And some of the risks are both audit and business risks. What differs or what matters is how you explain them. Remember, audit risks will have an impact on some figure in the financial statements, and you are required to actually explain what could go wrong in the financial statements. And at the planning stage also, we need to consider fraud. And fraud is a high risk, fraud and the laws and regulations as well, okay? And the risks that are related to those, because they could cause financial statements to be misstated. We should know the provisions of these 2 standards, ISA 240 on fraud and ISA 250 on laws and regulations, and the responsibilities for fraud and laws and regulations. Primarily, the management is responsible, not the auditors. Management is responsible for putting in place internal controls to prevent fraud. And also management is responsible for the company adhering to whatever laws and regulations that are applicable. And we know what non-compliance with laws and regulations can do. In the country right now, there's a case where there was a contamination of water in a river by a mining house, and they've been taken to court, and they are required to compensate the people who suffered loss as a result of that contamination. And so it has got audit significance in the sense that provisions should be made in the financial statements for any compensation that they may be required to pay. Let's know the audit strategy and the audit plan and the contents of each of these documents. You may be required to explain what matters should be contained in an audit strategy and what matters in the audit plan. Audit documentation, very, very important. All audit work must be documented because that is the basis of the opinion. That is the basis of the work that has been done, and it facilitates or they facilitate review of the work that is done. And so documentation is basically in two forms of files, the current audit file and the permanent audit file. Let's be aware of what is contained in each of those files. The permanent file normally will contain information that will be of a continuing nature that will be required from one audit to another, whereas the current audit file contains all the work that has been done in terms of the current audit under the audit under review. Internal controls, very, very important area, again, where students perform very badly in terms of internal controls. And a bit of common sense can help us know and be able to deal with this particular topic. We are talking about the control activities. We must know what the control activities are. When we talk of internal control, what is it that we are talking about? We must be able to identify and explain that these are the control activities. We must know the control objectives. The control objective is basically what is the reason for the controls that have been put in place. What is the reason for the controls that have been put in place? In other words, before putting in a control, there must be a reason. Okay, and then the test of control is basically what the auditor, for the procedures the auditors perform to test whether or not the controls are operating. Let me give a simple illustration. Let's talk of a payment to suppliers. Normally, suppliers will send invoices to the company for the company to be able to pay. And so one risk that is there is that payments may be made for fictitious items, or indeed duplicate payments can be made. And so to prevent that, the company might say, we are going to only we make payments which are supported by original copies of the invoices, original copy of the purchase order. That is a control. In other words, without the originals, no payment will go through. So the control activity is ensuring that all payments are supported by original copies of the invoice and the order. The control objective is the reason for the control. Why are we putting that control in place? To prevent duplicate payments. Then the test of control is where the auditors now come in to test whether or not those controls are operating effectively. Then they perform tests of controls, and we'll learn how the auditors actually will talk briefly on how the auditors perform tests of control. Reliance on the effectiveness of controls and the impact on further audit procedures. It's saddening that some students do not understand why auditors perform tests of controls. Auditors are required to obtain evidence on all material items in the financial statements. And so what they do, because of limited time, they may want to rely on the effectiveness of internal controls of the entity. And so before they do that, they will conduct tests of control. If the results of the test of control show that the controls were operating effectively, then the auditors may perform less audit work, less audit procedures. Whereas if the results of the test of controls show that the controls in this particular entity are not operating effectively, then they will not rely on the controls. They will follow a substantive approach to auditing. Quite important. So auditors will plan the audit, they will decide what audit work they will do, then they will go ahead and gather the evidence by performing audit procedures. A few things we need to know there. We are saying the basis for the opinion is sufficient, appropriate audit evidence. These are two terms. It's not one term. Sufficient in terms of the quantity of evidence obtained, appropriate in terms of the quality of the evidence. It must be relevant to the audit objective that is there. We must be clear on what is meant by financial statement assertions. And the relationship between financial statement assertions and audit procedures. Assertions are basically claims made by management contained in the figures in the financial statements. For example, there's an assertion of existence. If there's a figure of motor vehicles in the financial statements, one of the assertions or claims made by management is that these vehicles represented by the figure in the financial statements existed or exist at the period end. That is an assertion. And so auditors will perform audit procedures to test that particular assertion. There's a relationship between financial statement assertions and the audit procedures performed. When designing audit procedures, the auditors will have in mind a particular claim or assertion. Because the idea is to confirm whether or not those claims they hold. Okay. And in tests of control, basically we explained the reason for conducting tests of control is to basically get results to decide on whether or not to rely on internal controls. Substantive audit procedures, on the other hand, the objective is to test for material misstatements or figures in the financial statements. So auditors will always have to perform substantive audit procedures for all material amounts, because the objective is to see or confirm whether or not the financial statements are misstated. So let's know the distinction between tests of controls and the objective of tests of controls, and the substantive audit procedures and the objective. Directional testing. Okay, there is one approach that auditors use in auditing. Basically, if you can't remember anything, at least remember that the accounts are prepared on the basis of double entry. For every debit entry, there's a corresponding what? Credit entry. So directional testing, basically what the auditors or the accountants have said is, let's test assets and expenses for overstatement only. Okay, assets and expenses, we test them for overstatements. Liabilities and income, we test them for understatement. But then because of the double entry principles, if one side is overstated, let's say the assets are overstated, then it means the corresponding credit is also overstated. Okay, so you just test assets and expenses in one direction for overstatement. But by so doing, you are indirectly testing the corresponding credit for overstatement and vice versa. So quite important to be able to explain this to students. Okay, right. And then we have got sampling. We should know what sampling is as well. Okay, sampling is a very important concept. In other words, auditors do not test all items. So let's know the various sampling methods that are in use: random sampling, statistical sampling. Let's be aware of those. And then the specific areas of accounting that we need to know. Again, clear evidence that most of us do not understand: the accounting for tangible non-current assets and the provisions of IAS 16. If you don't know that, then you will not be able to conduct or to design suitable audit procedures. Inventory and the inventory count and the provisions of IAS 2. Inventory should be valued at the law of cost and net realizable value. And so the auditors, their aim will be to confirm whether or not management has complied with that standard. So you need to know what the standard says and then apply the information in the scenario to the provisions of the standard. We should know the accounting for receivables and sales and the allowances for receivables or bad debts. Let's be aware of the age analysis, which is prepared by management and given to the auditors, showing how old the receivables are and also how the applicable, the relevant accounting standards provide in terms of the allowances for receivables. Cash and bank provisions and accruals, very, very important. We should know the accounting for provisions. We should know that now there is no big bath. You cannot just make a general provision. You need to have specific provisions. So if you don't know that, then it means you can't apply your auditing knowledge to something that you do not know. Capital and directors' emoluments, very, very important. And then after that, there's obviously evaluation of audit evidence and concluding on specific areas. Having done the work, then the senior people in the firm will evaluate the evidence that has been obtained and decide on the opinion that should be given. Quite important. So we start with planning, execution of the audit, then review. Now let's look at the internal controls in a little more detail, because this is one area where the performance has been bad over the last few years. We need to know the meaning of internal controls and the responsibilities for internal control. It is management responsible for putting in place internal control, not the auditors. That is the role of management. Okay, and then the objective, obviously, of the internal controls that are put is to prevent and help detect fraud and error. And so we should also be aware of the systems in a business, a typical business. We should know the inventory system, the goods received note, goods received note, the orders, purchase orders, and all that. We need to know that. The purchases system, the payroll system, the capital and revenue expenditure, and cash and bank. We need to be aware of the controls, the systems. Only then can we be able to identify the non-existence of controls or suggest suitable controls. We need to know the documentation in each of these systems and the typical internal control in each system. We need to be aware of the segregation of duties, the authorization, and so on. Okay, and then we need to know, like I earlier said, the connection between internal control activities, the control objective, and test of control. The control activity is the control that is put in place. The actual control, authorization, for example, is a control activity. Control objective is the reason for the control. Authorization is necessary to ensure that no unauthorized payment or yes payment is made, for example. Test of control is the procedure performed by the auditors to check the effectiveness or lack thereof of the control activity. So if we want to test the control of authorization, we can pick orders that have been raised and executed and confirm whether or not they've been authorized correctly by the correct person. We are testing the control. Very, very important. We must know the use of internal controls by the external auditors, basically to determine the extent of further procedures that should be undertaken. And of course, we need to know the methods of recording internal control systems and the related advantages and disadvantages. When auditors are planning the audit and they are performing risk assessment, they also evaluate the controls that exist and they need to record these controls. And there are a number of ways in which this can be done, including narrative notes where they write, or including flowcharts or internal control questionnaires. We should know those different methods which are clearly explained in the study manual and the advantages and disadvantages of each of those methods. Okay, in terms of internal controls and the examination, now let's go to the exam. Candidates may be required to do any of the following: identify and explain the internal control weaknesses and suggest suitable improvements. That you may be required to do that, and I'm sure you've seen past exam questions requiring candidates to do that. And this is a type of question that students find relatively easy. Alternatively, for the same topic, you may be required to suggest suitable internal control activities. Unlike where you are just required to identify because they've given them to you, in this case, they're saying you suggest, given this information, what controls would you put in place? For both, you need to understand the system that is in use. Or it could be asked to explain the test of controls for a given internal control activity. They ask you what these, or they give you the internal control activities, suggest suitable test of controls. It's another way you could be asked in the exam. Okay, for example, using the information in the scenario, I just thought I should put this so that you see how it has been examined in the past. Part 1 says suggest internal control activities that should be put in place. Part 2 says explain the control objective. What is the objective of the control activities you have suggested there? Then the last one says explain the test of control for each of those. So we'll see how a question like this can be answered in an effective manner in the exam. And you can see that they are related. So the examiner may give you a specific number, suggest 3, and then it means you have to explain 3 of each of these requirements. They could ask you to explain the objectives of test of control. What is the objective of carrying out tests of control and to the auditor and so on. Explain the information that should be contained in a letter of weakness. They can ask you that. Well, what information do you expect in a letter of weakness? Unless you know what a letter of weakness is, you can't be able to answer that particular question. Explain the limitations of internal controls in a client company. Meaning, even if you've got internal controls in place, what are the shortcomings? What can cause fraud and error to go undetected? Again, they're clearly explained in the manual. And you can see the verb that is being used there is basically explain, explain, and so on. What are the common mistakes in dealing with internal control questions? Failure to suggest suitable internal control activities, where the student just fails, he doesn't know what the internal control activities that should be put in place. So failure to explain the control objective, or indeed explaining management responses to control weaknesses. Yes, that's a very important one. You are required to recommend what action to explain the management. You explain management responses instead of test of control. The question requires you to explain the test of control. Then you start explaining the response of management. This topic, internal controls, is from the point of view of the auditor, not management. Let's be very, very clear with that. Poor presentation of answers when required to suggest controls, stating control objectives and tests of control. and we'll see in another 1 or 2 slides from now how the presentation should be. You should make it easy for the marker to award due marks. And therefore, presentation is very, very critical here. Clear lack of understanding of the use of internal controls. Some students show that they do not understand what internal controls are for, and also what they are relevant, what is their relevance to the audit. Quite important. I think we explained earlier on, the internal controls is 25 and 20% of the syllabus for each of these papers, and we should know the marks that are most likely going to come, which means every exam, actually a good typical auditing exam should always have questions on internal controls. And these questions, the examiner may choose to examine the same topic in 2 different questions to avoid students avoiding answering it, let's say in the optional question. You can have 10 marks in the compulsory question on internal controls for day 11, and another 15 marks in another question elsewhere, as long as the total marks are within the syllabus weightage. Okay, substantive audit procedures, we said for all material items, auditors are supposed to perform substantive audit procedures. What are they? This is where they perform analytical procedures and the test of details of transactions and balances. The aim is to test for material misstatements. That's the whole objective. Are the figures misstated? What do we mean by misstated? Either they are over or understated. Material in the sense that only material issues will concern the auditors. If they are not material, then they may not have any audit significance. The objective of substantive procedures, we've already said, is to test for misstatements of figures. Accounting for specific areas, again, you have to know what audit procedures are you going to conduct in terms of additions to non-current assets, in terms of disposals of non-current assets. Now, if you don't know the accounting for additions, you don't know the accounting for disposals and the related documentation, you are unlikely to suggest suitable audit procedures, you see. We should know again the relationship between financial statement assertions and the audit procedures, whereby auditors consider the assertions being tested when designing audit procedures. The examiners have in the past asked you to suggest suitable audit procedures stating the assertion being tested, because it's very important. You must know the link. So you can't just give a general procedure. Your procedure must be related to the assertion that you are testing. For example, you can't say inspect the motor vehicles, the tangible non-current assets. And what is the assertion? Rights and obligations. That is wrong, because inspecting a motor vehicle does not confirm that it belongs to the client. The correct procedure will be inspect the white book, which is the evidence of ownership. When you inspect the white book, you expect it to be in the name of the client. So there must be a correct relationship between the procedure and the assertion. You don't just rush and so on. Think about it and so on. Describing substantive audit procedures to test given assertion, we are required to do that. And the audit risk for specific figures in the financial statements. Always, especially where there's a risk equation, always ask yourself what can go wrong in terms of this particular figure. That's what makes an audit risk. What can go wrong in this figure? Then it means you will be able to explain. Substantive audit procedures and the examination will be required to do the following. Explain audit procedures for given figures as the syllabus. Explain the audit work you expect to find on tangible non-current assets. Maybe you are now an audit manager or an audit senior and you are reviewing work that has been done. You are expected to know what to look out for. So you will be required to explain what you expect to find when you are reviewing the audit working papers, or indeed explain the meaning of financial statement assertions. Common mistakes: explaining procedures for assertions not required, like I've already explained. If the examiner says, give us the audit procedures for the following assertions, it means the procedures must be relevant to those assertions and not any other that you may think of. It must be related, because we want to see whether you know the relationship. Explaining financial statement assertions in describing audit procedures when not required. In other words, it's very common for students to start explaining financial statement assertions instead of using them to describe audit procedures. Are we together? Or if the examiner just wants you to explain the audit procedures, then without stating the assertion, even if you state, it means there are no marks. So let's just restrict ourselves to the question requirements. Are we together? And another common mistake is where students explain methods of obtaining evidence as if they are audit procedures. You talk of inquiry, you talk of observation, without using those to explain the audit procedures. Those methods should be used to describe the audit work. So explaining the methods of audit of obtaining of the evidence does not describe the audit procedures that will be required, unless the examiner specifically requires you to explain any 3 methods that auditors use to obtain evidence. Okay, common for candidate to simply not attempting to describe audit procedures. It's an area where a lot of students just leave it blank, which means they do not understand, and it's unlikely then that they will marshal enough marks to pass the exam. And then candidates simply stating instead of explaining, like we said in terms of what you need to pass the exam. If the examiner wants you to explain, please just explain, not necessarily just stating. You may only get half the marks, and we need these halves. 6 halves gives 3 marks, and we need those marginal marks. Many candidates simply suggesting obtaining written representations even where it's not relevant. It's a common procedure, just say obtain written representation, even where it's not relevant. It's important to understand that written representations on their own are not adequate evidence. They are there just basically to support other evidence. So this is a core area of the syllabus where we are required to demonstrate that we understand. Remember, whether you are doing DA11 or CA2.3, these are standalone qualifications. And if you don't know these basics, you go and work for an audit firm, you embarrass yourself and you also embarrass the profession who would have awarded you that particular qualification. So it's a core area of the syllabus. We need to just have to understand it. We still have 10 days to go. Okay, review is the final stage towards the end of the audit. Okay, it comes towards the end of the audit. It's basically a review of the audit work, and it's done on a continuous basis by the audit senior and the audit manager, and finally the engagement partner who is responsible for issuing the opinion. You see, so they will review the work to make sure it has been done in accordance with relevant auditing standards. We should be aware of subsequent events, very easy marks where students lose subsequent events. We should be aware of active and passive duty of the auditors. Together, we should be aware of the provisions of IS 10 in terms of adjusting and non-adjusting events. What happens if an event is discovered, according to ISA 560, between the date of issue of the financial statements and the AGM, which means you need to know the critical dates, year end, the next event, signing of the audit report, issue of the audit report, and then the annual general meeting. And if anything comes up between those dates, you are expected to demonstrate that you understand. So we should know the provisions of the auditing standard, which is 560 there. Very, very important. Going concern is a very important aspect of our studies, which the assumption that the company will continue operating in the near foreseeable future of not less than 12 months. And it is critical in the sense that it hinges on the basis of preparing financial statements. If a company is a going concern, financial statements are prepared on the historical cost basis, on the going concern assumption. If it is not a going concern, then they are prepared on a breakup basis. So it's very important to know, using the information in the scenario, and even when we are doing a risk equation, look out for any going concern issues. We should be able to explain the indicators of going concern problems. Companies do not just collapse. There are signs, and we need to know these signs: financial indicators, operational indicators, and other indicators. And we must know also the meaning of material uncertainty and the impact on the audit report. Okay, material uncertainty, how does it impact the opinion and the report? Basically, it depends on the disclosures made by management. Let's be aware of the uncorrected misstatements and the impact on the opinion, ISA 450. At the end of the audit, the auditors will add up and say, this is the total amount of uncorrected misstatement. They will probably extrapolate and say, since these are sample results, the whole population is misstated to this extent. Then they will compare that total of uncorrected misstatements with the materiality level. And that's what will help them decide whether or not the financial statements are misstated. Are we together, colleagues? Very, very important. Uncorrected misstatements have been examined in the past. Sorry about that. There's a small hitch. Okay, uncorrected misstatements have been examined, and they can come in any exam. In terms of reporting, reporting the end. Very simple topic, really. Again, this is where students show that they lack understanding. There are 4 or 5 standards that we need to know of. ISA 700, which is forming an opinion in the independent auditor's report. Let's know the difference between an unmodified report and an unmodified report. Unmodified opinion and an unmodified opinion. Okay, elements of the audit report. In other words, what is contained in a standard unmodified report? You can be asked to explain, just to state the elements of an unmodified report, meaning the opinion paragraph, the introduction, the addressee, should be able to explain that. We should be aware of the ISA 701 key audit matters and how auditors determine the key audit matters from those matters that they would have communicated with those charged with governance. And the fact that key audit matters paragraph is mandatory for listed companies. They have to have a key audit matters paragraph, even when they do not have any key audit matters to report on. That paragraph must be there, and they must be able to say we have no matters to report on. ISA 705 is the one that deals with modification of the opinion of the auditors, and there are 3 forms of modification. Either the auditors can issue a qualified opinion, an adverse opinion, or a disclaimer of opinion. The question is, how do they decide on which one of these to issue? It depends on 2 factors, basically materiality and pervasiveness. Depends on the materiality and pervasiveness of the matter. If a matter is material, in fact, materiality and pervasiveness, and also whether or not the auditors obtained sufficient appropriate evidence. That's the easiest way to manage this. Consider, first of all, where they've obtained sufficient appropriate evidence, then consider what happens when there's a limitation of scope. So basically, when the auditors have obtained all the evidence they require, and then there's a matter of concern, and the matter is material but not pervasive, they will issue a qualified opinion. If the matter is material and pervasive, they will issue an adverse opinion. Are we together? Whereas if there was a limitation of scope, again, it means the auditors have not obtained all the evidence they require. If the matter is material and not pervasive, they will still issue a qualified opinion. But if it's material and pervasive, they will issue a disclaimer. They can't issue an adverse opinion because they haven't obtained all the evidence that they require. ISA 706 was examined in the last exam. A lot of students could not explain or illustrate that they know the use of the emphasis of matter and other matter paragraphs. It's one standard. There are 2 separate paragraphs. And inclusion of these paragraphs result in the report becoming a modified report, but they don't result in a modified opinion. Including an emphasis of matter paragraph does not result in the opinion being modified. Very, very important to understand. Like the name suggests, emphasis of matter, which are simply trying to emphasize a matter that is correctly accounted for, is in the financial statements, and they feel they should make mention of it. And so more or less some overlap between the emphasis of matter paragraph and the key audit matters paragraph. So the auditors should decide where to put a matter. But the other matter paragraph is for matters that don't need to be in the financial statements. But the auditors feel they need to make mention. And there are a number of examples that are given in the study manual. I can think of where the financial statements for the previous year were audited by different auditors. Then the auditors can include that matter in the other matter paragraph, not in the emphasis of matter paragraph. Very, very important. And we should know also that previously, the emphasis of matter paragraph could be used to explain material uncertainty. Now it's no longer the same. The other matter paragraph was used to explain inconsistencies in other information. Now it's no longer the case. So let's be very, very clear. If we know this information, we can even critique a suggested report that is wrong. Other information, another area that we need to be very clear of. Remember, financial statements, when you talk of financial statements, we are talking about the profit or loss account and the statement of financial position and the related notes. Now, usually, for most companies, these financial statements, which we have audited as auditors, are contained in documents containing financial statements. And these documents may have other information other than the financial statements. For example, they will have a director's report, a chairman's report, or ratios and so on, which are not really financial statements and which auditors may not have conducted audit procedures on. So the standard explains what the auditors, the responsibilities of auditors with regards to other information. Basically, to read through the other information, okay, to read through the other information and look out for any inconsistencies between the other information and the evidence that they have obtained. If there are inconsistencies, they'll ask management to correct either the financial statements or the other information. If management declines, then the auditors may consider modifying their opinion. So let's be very, very clear. You cannot have an idea, let us know. Okay, reports to management, we talked about weaknesses earlier on, is basically after the audit, the auditors would have found out some weaknesses, internal control weaknesses, as part of the audit. And so, as a byproduct of the audit, they will communicate these to management. And in the communication, they will clearly explain that this is for internal use and it's not meant to be relied upon. The report is not meant to be relied upon by outsiders. It's an internal control letter or a letter of weakness is one and the same thing. And what the information it will contain normally will be the weakness observed, brief explanation of the weakness, the implication observed, then the recommendation to remedy that weakness, and then the response of management. So you may be asked to explain the information in a letter of weakness. For example, let's say supporting documents to support a payment are not stamped with a paid stamp by the payments accountant. That is an internal control weakness. Why? Because the same documents may be resubmitted to make a fraudulent payment. So we observed as auditors, as we are conducting the audit, that supporting documents were not stamped. So I've explained the weakness. The implication is, if they are not stamped, they can be presented for fraudulent payment, resulting in a loss of funds for the company. So I've explained the implication. The recommendation, all paid documents, all supporting documents for payments made should be stamped, and the ones authorizing should ensure that they are stamped. So we've recommended. And then the response management will either say we agree with the recommendation or we are going to implement. So let's know what is contained in there. And if you're given a weakness, for example, in the exam, and they ask you to draft a letter of weakness, you should be able to give those small paragraphs to explain the weakness, the implication, the recommendation, and the response of the client. Common causes of failure in the exam. I'm monitoring my time, will give you time to ask questions. What are the common causes of students failing the exam? Attempting less than the required 4 questions, very few pass. If you attempt 3 questions, the best thing is to start studying, unless you are somehow, for some reason, you will pass. You are unlikely to get 50 marks if you attempt less than 4 questions. And there's evidence to that effect, and we'll see. Leaving parts of questions unanswered. A lot of students do not answer all the parts of the questions. When you add up the unanswered parts, they add up sometimes to the equivalent of a whole question. You don't lose any marks for making an intelligent guess. Don't leave out any part unanswered. Try. If you have studied, you have gone through the syllabus, there's something you can say. So do not leave any parts unanswered. Not using the information in the scenario, in answering scenario-based questions. If you just give general answers, you won't get maximum marks. And this can make a difference between passing and failing. Not addressing the question requirements. Read the question. If they want you to explain business risks, then don't explain audit risks. Just make sure you understand the requirements and you ensure you address the requirements in your answer. Your heading in the answer should briefly explain what you're answering. If I were a student, I would say advantages of this, so the marker knows what you're answering. And that will help you also ensure that you have dealt with all the requirements of the examiner. Candidates not addressing question requirements in multi-required requirement questions, where there's a question, you do this and do this. We must deal with both. Explain and give disadvantages. If you leave out the disadvantages, you won't get the maximum marks, because for any requirement, for all the requirements, there are marks that you are going to be awarded. So read the question carefully and ensure that you have addressed all the question requirements without exception. Clear lack of knowledge, obviously, in some cases, you can see wild answers, nothing to anything that is auditing goes, even if it's not relevant to the examination question. It doesn't work like that. Clear understanding of provisions of auditing standards. You don't need to memorize the auditing standards, but at least you are expected to know what the standards provide. You are expected to know that ISA 250 provides that management is responsible for complying with laws and regulations. Even if you can't mention ISA 250, but that fact you are expected to know. poor lack of knowledge, obviously, for specific accounting requirements, such as accounting estimates. What are accounting estimates? What is the audit risk, fair value accounting, and so on, assets held for sale, where students do not understand, then obviously that is a very big problem in terms of answering exam questions. Poor handwriting. Sometimes, if the examiner can't read what you have written, then most likely you will not get maximum marks. If they can't read it, they give it to anyone, they will not be able to read it. So let's be careful, remembering that people are going to read these solutions. They are not marked by computers, but by human beings. Wrong numbering of solutions. You can risk being marked wrong as a result of putting wrong numbers. Just make sure you put the correct question reference on your answer. Are we together, colleagues? Very, very important. If you give wrong numbers, they may think that this is a correct answer to the wrong question and mark you wrong. You risk, although there are quality control systems in place, but they can fail like all systems. Writing in margins, please do not write in the margin. That is where the marks for the examiners or the markers are put. If you write in the margins and then they put marks in there, they may not be able to collect or pick those marks. If the answer booklet clearly says do not write in this margin, for some reason, some students feel, well, let's just write, it doesn't matter. It matters. You are just risking your marks may be missed. I'm not saying they're missed, they may be missed. Writing too much for marks on offer. A question is for 2 marks, you write 2 pages. No matter how accurate it is, maximum marks you get is 2 marks. Let's use our judgment in terms of what we are going to write. And writing everything and anything about a topic without considering the question requirements. It's very common, and no marks will be awarded. Some of the answers go through the examiner's comments. There are examples of answers students give. Some of them, you just laugh and say, well, there's a problem here. Completely off as long as it's auditing, but nothing to do with the question requirements. Evidence of self-study and short tuition period. A lot of students, I think, take these exams in very short periods of time in terms of preparation. Ordinarily, you need 6 clear months of proper tuition to understand the subject matter and be able to demonstrate that you've acquired the skills that are necessary. So really, give yourself enough time to go through the paper, then you pass first time. But if the results come out, then you make a decision, I'll write auditing in 3 months or 2.5 months, most likely you have challenges. Poor answer presentation, and we are going to see how that is affecting the answering. Numbering of solutions, use some numbering, please. What we are saying is the question papers have got numbers. A, part question 1A, A1, Roman numerical, and so on. Just follow the same numbering, because that's what will show the examiner what you are answering. Try by all means to use the same numbering. Don't start creating unnecessarily creating your own numbering. Just number the solutions according to the question. Follow instructions. Some students still start a new question on the same page as the previous solution. And yet, the instructions are clear. That start a new question on a new page. Even if you want to lose marks for doing so, you are risking. They may miss out something. They may mark you wrong for the part that you started on the end of another question. Please, let's follow clear instructions. Okay, currently, correctly taking attempted questions. Again, some students will take either 4 and they've attempted 3 and so on. It just frustrates actually the mark, and it shows that we probably don't care. Let's just make sure we take the correct questions in terms of answering. And points answering the question requirements should be clear against general writing. You should be able to say, this is an answer, I deserve a mark on this. Leave a line, I deserve a mark on this, and so on. Don't write generally. You cannot hide in doing a lot of writing. The examiners will read through and be able to highlight and pick what is correct and so on. In terms of presentation, please take note of the following. A question requires, let's say, identify and explain in part A. And then for each item in part A, suggest a suitable audit response. Columnar form is recommended. It will save you a lot of time. As long as you clearly explain, sure. I've said on that slide, solution 1, part A, risk and explanation. So the examiner or the marker will know that this is your answer to part A. Then in the next column, you've indicated clearly part B, suitable response. And therefore, the two are easily related. That's the beauty with this particular format. You will know that the response here is for part number 1 and so on. So the examiner will have no problems. And it's the same with internal control weaknesses, or identify internal control procedures and the objectives. You can put them in columnar form as long as you clearly label your answers, you see. Alternative presentation is where you identify in part A, you say number 1, 2, 3. Then in part B, number 1 should be related to number 1 in part A. Number 2 should be related to number 2 in part A, and so on. If you mix them up, although you may currently not lose any marks, but it shows that you are being unprofessional really. But the most recommended is the columnar form. So the order in part B should be the same as the order in part A. Okay. In terms of risky questions, please run through that. I will be closing in about 10-15 minutes so that I give you time to explain. Requirement may be for identification of business and audit risk. Just be skeptical. Read the question carefully. Most of the risks are obvious. The examiners cannot ask you to identify something that is not in the question. So if you read and understood the topic, you should be able to answer the question. There are certain risks that we should look out for, like accounting estimates and so on, and look out for anything that has an impact on the financial statements. Just be skeptical. Then you'll be able to say, no, I think this is an audit risk and so on. And in responding to those audit risks, look at it from the point of view of the auditors, not management. What will the auditors do? Having identified the risk, what is your audit response? Because you are the ones as auditors who are going to form an opinion. And we've given on the next page, there are common mistakes in answering risky questions. I'm sure they will share this presentation explaining business risks when the question requires audit risks, not using the information in the scenario. Explaining elements of audit risk, which is inherent, control, and detection risk, which is not answering the question. You have been asked to identify and explain risks in the question. Then you start explaining those elements. Unless a question requires you to specifically explain the elements of audit risk, you will not get marks. Explaining the auditor response were not required. If a question just wants you to identify risks and doesn't say explain the responses, then just identify risks. Don't show them that you know that they are responses, because they may not give you marks because they've not requested you, and you are wasting valuable exam time. Okay, and giving management responses, I think we've already mentioned that. Describing and explaining less than the required number of audit risks. If they want 4, try and identify 4. Poor presentation, I think we have talked about it. Okay, then ethics are very important. In terms of ethics, we must know what the fundamental principles are and the threats to auditors of not adhering to the ethical issues. It's a very important topic. It's core in terms of our profession. We should know what these ethical issues are. And in answering exam questions where they ask you to identify and explain the ethical issues and maybe explain the safeguards, make sure you use the information in the scenario. Make sure you use the information in the scenario. Common mistakes. We are asked to identify and explain ethics. Then you start explaining what is integrity, what is the confidentiality, and so on, without dealing with the information in the scenario. No marks will be given or are given, even if it's correct. Candidates failing to describe the ethical issues clearly. Candidates not suggesting suitable safeguards when the examiner requires you to explain safeguards. Candidates suggesting safeguards in questions not requiring safeguards. If they don't require them, then don't give them. Read the question carefully. Again, poor presentation or explaining less than the required number of ethical matters. To go to reviews again, candidates may be required to explain comparative information. You must know what comparative information is. We talked about other information, very, very important. Subsequent events are a common exam question, and the examples of adjusting and non-adjusting events. We must know where the client has not done the correct thing and they need to ask them to correct. Candidates may be required to critique a suggested opinion. In other words, the examiner may give you, this is the work that has been done, and this matter is material and so on. The suggested opinion is a qualified opinion. Now use the information in the scenario to confirm whether indeed it is the correct opinion. Together. Don't just say the correct opinion is an adverse opinion. No, you need to justify. Candidates may be required to suggest a suitable opinion given certain information. May be required to explain the forms of opinions and like modified opinions, for example, the 3 forms of modified opinions and the circumstances under which each one may be issued. candidates may be required to explain the meaning and use of the audit report, including going concern, paragraph, and material uncertainty, and so on, the emphasis of matter or the other matter paragraphs. So which means we really need to understand the common mistakes given there in terms of review, inability to explain the audit risk with regards opening balances. Okay, what is the risk with regards opening balances, subsequent events, and so on? A lack of understanding of accounting provisions for subsequent events, where you don't know whether the client has done the correct thing or not. You're unable to use the information in the scenario to explain subsequent events. Or forms of opinion, you fail to explain what the forms of opinion are and the issues to do with materiality and pervasiveness. Failure to suggest with justification a suggested opinion, just say qualified opinion, without stating where the matter is considered or you've assumed is material and pervasive, then it's an adverse opinion. If the logic is correct, even if the actual opinion given is wrong, you will get some marks for showing understanding of the impact of materiality and pervasiveness. Lack of knowledge of paragraphs such as the key audit matters paragraph, emphasis of matter, and other matter paragraphs. Those are the common mistakes. Now, this is what I've done in the next 5 minutes. I want us to please look at the paper that we sat for DA11, so that we see whether or not it was a challenging paper. You see? Okay. The total number of candidates who sat for this paper was 103, and I think only 3 out of 103 passed this exam. That was very, very poor indeed. And you can see the average score, I think, is given there is very low, below, much less than 50%. And then out of these 103 candidates, 11 attempted 3 questions, and none of these passed the paper. And when you look at the average score of those that attempted less than 4 questions, it's very low, signifying that actually time is not the factor, but lack of knowledge. Otherwise, the average score would have been much higher than what is shown there, you see. And you can see in the average score per each question, the 3 questions there, question 1, 2, and 3, the average score is 8, 4, and 5. Average score for all candidates across the 103. It was in question 1, it was 10 marks. Question 2, 4 marks, and so on, all below 50% of the marks, you see. Are we together? And the average score of those that passed the exam, the 3 that passed the exam, was 56%, whereas the average score of those that failed was 23%, which is very low, signifying that there is actually a problem in terms of our understanding. Okay, very, very important to note that. Then review of the exam again, let's look at it. Let's quickly run through question 1. And what I did, I've put the maximum marks and the easy marks. And you can challenge me or challenge yourself and say, look, is this correct really? Explain why auditors should have rights. It's 2 marks. 1 mark is easy. I will not go through each one of these. You can go through at your own time. But looking at this question, 19 of the 25 marks were easy marks. A well-prepared student should have scored 19, at least as a bare minimum 15. If you go to the next question, again, it's the same. You can see on part B1, I've put easy marks 0. Let's assume there are no easy marks. But the question was simple. Explain again, selection approach and so on. But again, you can see there that 14 marks are easy marks. You go to the next one, you will see that 16 of the 25 marks are easy marks there as well. And I was trying to be as realistic as I possibly can I've said part 3A, 2 out of 4 were easy marks. Let's assume part B2, there were no easy marks. I put 0 there and so on. But still, you can see that 16 marks were fairly easy marks. Question 4 as well, 11 out of the 25. Assuming, and trying to be as realistic as we can possibly be. And then the last question, those explain 4 audit risks. So 6, at least get 6 out of 8, because that's a simple question. Okay, state 4 matters in a typical audit working paper. Let's assume we get nothing, and then so on. And the rest are basically simple questions, and 21 out of the maximum marks were easy marks. When you look at this summary, you will notice that from the whole paper, a total of 125 marks, 81 marks were easy marks. 81 marks, and so a student could easily pass using the following combination, whereby question 1 and question 2 are both compulsory. So the marks for question 1 and 2 at the bottom there are the same. So regardless of which options you have, you can see an average student should have scored 60, 70, or 65, and yet the overall average was 23. And even if you divide these by 2, you still find that it's much higher than the average of 23. So really, it appears, looking at these numbers, the problem is in terms of not understanding the topics. The exam technique, as we try and conclude to give you time to ask questions, the objective is to enhance your chances of passing the exam. Now, even well-prepared students can fail if they mismanage themselves in the exam. The aim is to score 50 marks and go for the easy marks. By all means, go for the easy marks. The first question, the compulsory question for the CA2.3, 72 minutes, because it's 40 marks. You have to do it within 72 minutes. And 45 marks, 45 minutes for each of the 2 optional compulsory questions in DA11, which means 45 minutes, okay? And 36 minutes for the CA2.3 optional questions. Never overrun on time. That cannot be overemphasized. The moment you run overrun on time, you are likely not to finish the exam, or you attempt the last question under panic conditions. Use the 15 minutes reading time effectively. Attempt the required 4 questions, and you need all the marginal marks, even the last question. Make sure that when eliminating a question that you don't want to answer, is the worst question. So be very, very careful. Otherwise, you may find you attempt it, 10 minutes into the time, you change your mind, then you have lost time. Attempt all parts of the questions and use common sense where necessary. Use the information in the scenario. I think we've talked about that. Ensure points are clear and avoid overwriting. You write 3 pages and yet you only get 2 marks. There's no need. Just read the question requirements carefully. Don't be too brief, but explain such that someone can read and understand. Cover the whole syllabus like we earlier explained. Attempt examination standard questions during the exam preparation. I don't know how many of you in this meeting have attempted a mock exam, or you are going to attempt a mock in the actual exam. Quite risky indeed. It's better you can pick any past exam question, sit under exam conditions at home from 21 to midnight, and attempt it, and then compare your answer to the suggested solution. It will give you confidence. Read examination standard questions and solutions as well. Just read through 4 in the morning, 4 in the evening, question and answers, and attempt a mock under exam conditions. Mind your business in the exam. Do not be distracted by others. Clearly number your solutions using the numbering format. I think we've already mentioned that. Use short headings in labeling your answers. Some students literally copy the question. No mark is given for copying the question. Just advantages of computer-assisted audit techniques. Period. Don't just start repeating what the examiner has put. Just put short headings so that you show the examiner that your answer is on that particular topic. Use short but clear sentences in answering questions, and if possible, leave a line between points. You are together. Don't try too much such that you end up confusing yourself. You say a few truths and then and truths elsewhere and so on. Leave a line or so. Are we together? Note that there are always easy marks in every examination, and do not stress over what you do not know. Just go for the easy marks. And they are always there, and they will always be there. If it is difficult paper, then it is difficult for everybody. It's not only you, it's everybody. So you keep fighting until the invigilator tells you to stop. Only then do you stop writing. Remember, you can get 50 marks wrong and still pass the exam. You have 10 days to go from today, I think, to next Thursday. There are 10 days, and they are enough to make a difference if you do not panic. So do not panic now. Do not panic in the examination. And so basically, this marks the end of our presentation. I would like to leave the remaining time to you to give you an opportunity to ask, or even on matters that we may not have discussed this afternoon. Please feel free to ask. And if there are any matters that we have discussed that you need clarification on, please feel free to ask. I thank you. Any questions, please?
So, colleagues, if there is anyone who has a question, can come up.
Raise a hand.
Okay, Musa, you can go ahead. Musa Kapumpa, you may go ahead, and then we'll follow in that order. Gift Luboya. So far, these are the hands which are raised. Musa, you can go ahead. Mr. Musa, you are not responding. Mr. Luboya, you may go ahead with your question. Okay, I will read the question by Mr. Gift Luboya. Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Kindly assist me. What are some of the factors that we candidates are we supposed to put into consideration when identifying the audit risk?
All right. What are the factors that you should consider in identifying audit risk? Remember, audit risk is the risk that a figure in the financial statements may be misstated. Okay? And so ideally, we should be able, let me give you an example. Let's talk of inventory. Okay? Inventory is supposed to be valued at the law of cost and net realizable value. And if a company is, let's say, a pharmaceutical company, and we've got the year end, we know as accountants, well, we should know that inventory medicines can expire. We're together. Medicines can expire, and therefore, they should be the expired medicines cannot be valued at cost, and should be written off actually. So there is a risk that inventory valuation may be misstated. So you really need to have an understanding of a few basic things. Are we together, colleagues? So we are saying if there is depending on the nature of the company, is a pharmaceutical company and there is closing inventory and we are going to attend inventory count. We must understand or be aware that, in doing so, we must look out for obsolete what? Inventory. So the audit risk is that obsolete inventory may be valued at cost instead of net realizable value, which will most likely be lower than cost, that we have identified the risk. And so what do auditors do? They should, first of all, the response will be evaluate the inventory count instructions. Are they clear in terms of how obsolete inventory should be identified and separated from the rest of the inventory? We are responding. So we've identified that here there is a risk. Remember, it's just a risk. We are not saying something wrong has happened, but because of the nature, we need to understand as we go into audit that, there is a risk that inventory may be what? Misstated. Are we together, colleagues? Or it could be an accounting estimate. There's a provision. The question tells you that there's a court case at the end of the year. The finance manager was wrongly dismissed, and the finance manager has sued the company. Are we together? Has sued the company for damages and so on. And because which means the company may be liable to damages, and the figure of damages may be material. And so the auditors should be able to identify that, look, accounting estimates may be misstated. Are we together, colleagues? Accounting estimates will be misstated because it means provisions may be understated. And so how do auditors respond? You have identified that there's a risk here. So you look out You look at the contract, you can respond by looking at the contract that the finance manager has with the company, and also inquire from the legal people or the legal counsel of the client on what stage this case has reached. And if they've made any provision, what is the basis of that provision? So we have identified the risk is that provisions may be understated because the company may not consider or take into account the case that is before the courts. Are we together? So really, it's a number of things. That's why it goes with practice. It depends on the question, but be skeptical. Look out in terms of what is in the question. Sometimes it's obvious. I'll give you a final example. The company has undertaken repairs and refurbishment of equipment. Maybe it's a milling company. They have undertaken repairs and refurbishment of equipment. Immediately, what should come to mind is the classification of capital and revenue expenditure. There's a risk that some capital expenditure will be written off to profit or loss, or vice versa. So we identify immediately, since we have now identified a planning stage, that was a huge repair and refurbishment of equipment. So there's a risk that items may be misclassified in the financial statements. How do we respond? What is the response? We'll tell the audit team members, can we be skeptical? Let's use professional skepticism and look out for any misclassification of the expenditure by reviewing the supporting documents. Are we together, colleagues? I hope I've tried to answer your question.
Thank you. Hope that question has been answered. We have got another hand. Is that hand raised, Mr. Musa, or you have just mistakenly raised your hands? Is there other question? Anyone? Okay, Mr. Alex, you can go ahead with your question.
Alex, please go ahead. You're raising your hand. What's the question? Unmute your mic and then.
He has written.
Okay.
That's the person to go ahead.
You kindly go ahead, please. Yes, that's all.
You can just leave the home mode slide mode.
Hello? Hello? Anyone, please ask if you have any question. We still have a few minutes. Can someone confirm that you are hearing us, please? Any questions? Anyone, please just go ahead and ask your question. We still have a few minutes. We started a bit late. In fact, we still have some 10 minutes or so. It's very important that you ask, even on topics that we may not have covered. Your questions are very, very important, and, you know, they could make a difference.
We are unable to mute themselves.
Okay.
I can mute them. I can mute Alex.
Yeah. So there are two questions which we have received. The second one talks about explaining who the component auditors are. I must say, this is a 3.2 syllabus area. Component auditors are basically the auditors of the subsidiaries. The parent company may have its own auditors. The component auditors are auditors of the subsidiaries. And the parent company or the group auditors rely on financial statements that were audited by component auditors. So I will not go any further in explaining this because it's specifically not in the syllabus for DA11 and CA2.3. But in the other question says, can you explain what the types of opinion that may be there? Okay, I will try and explain that once again. Okay, the opinions that auditors can issue can either be a modified opinion or an unmodified opinion. An unmodified opinion is issued when the auditor is happy and they've obtained evidence and they conclude that the financial statements are not misstated. They will issue an unmodified opinion. And the wording of the unmodified opinion will go something like, the accounts show a true and fair view. So the auditors are happy, there is no matter of concern, and they will issue an unmodified opinion. On the other hand, auditors may have a matter of concern that prohibits them or stops them from issuing an unmodified opinion, which means they can issue a modified opinion. And ISA 705 gives guidance on the possible forms of modification of the opinion. And the best way to look at it is to consider, even if you are reviewing or you are considering information in the scenario, you need to establish one thing or two things for that matter. Is the matter material to the financial statements? Okay, and then is the matter pervasive to the financial statements? What impact does it have on decisions made by users of the financial statements? The good news is you just know pervasiveness. You don't need to explain what pervasiveness means, but for our purposes, let's say what is the impact of this matter to the users. If it has got serious implications, then it is pervasive. So you must consider materiality and pervasiveness in deciding on the form of modification of the opinion according to ISA 705. Now, let's look at two situations. The first situation is where the auditor has obtained sufficient appropriate evidence. There's no limitation of scope. We've obtained all the evidence that we require. And then at the end of it, or in reviewing the audit working papers, we have a matter of concern. So the question is, what form of modification of the three should we issue? So the auditors will ask themselves, is this matter material? If the answer is yes, they say, okay, yes, the matter is material to the financial statements. Then the next question is it pervasive in terms of the use considered by the users of financial statements? The answer can either be yes or no. So it's material. If the answer is no, it's not pervasive, then the auditors should issue a qualified opinion. They will say, except for this matter, the accounts show a true and fair view. Are we together, colleagues? But if the matter is material and also is pervasive, then the auditors will issue an adverse opinion. They'll issue an adverse opinion. Are we together? The second situation is where the auditors, there's a limitation of scope, and the auditors have not obtained all the evidence they require. Again, you use the same criteria. And there's a matter of concern. Is the matter material? Yes, it's material. Is it pervasive? No, it's not pervasive. Again, the auditors will still issue a qualified opinion. They'll say, except for this matter, the accounts show a true and fair view. If, however, there's a limitation of scope and the matter is both material, yes, and pervasive, then they will issue a disclaimer of opinion because they've not obtained all the evidence they require. They will state that we have been unable to form an opinion. Are we together? Very, very important. The auditors will say we are not in a position to form an opinion. That's a disclaimer of opinion. Any follow-up question? Or have I explained it adequately? Or if anyone still has doubts, we can still explain. Yes, Musa, go ahead.
Yes, okay. So the first question is on how we can answer questions that contain pronouns like evaluations. Then the second question is about how can you recommend the use of bulleting points and numbering when a question is raised. For example, maybe if you are asked to state and explain elements of an assurance engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there are two questions. How do you deal with revaluation? That's another area where you need to know, for you to be able to suggest, for example, suitable audit procedures, you need to know the accounting for revaluation where there has been a revaluation of properties, for example, in a client company. Which means we must know the use of the revaluation account and whether or not the revaluation is being carried out for the first time, because that's what matters, and whether or not the revaluation results in a revaluation surplus or a revaluation loss. If, for example, a company is conducting a revaluation for the first time and there's a revaluation loss, then that loss should be debited to the profit or loss account. And so the auditor's concern will be, they'll ask management to provide them with details of the revaluations that have been carried out. And for each revaluation, they will check, is this the first time that you are revaluing? Is the result a revaluation surplus or a revaluation loss? If it's a surplus, then it will be credited to revaluation reserve. If it is a loss, it will be debited to profit or loss. If they do the opposite, then that is wrong accounting. Either you ask management to correct that. Are we together? Or if they refuse, it would have an impact on the audit opinion. Are we together, colleagues? So really, it's about the accounting. First of all, before you can decide or suggest suitable accounting auditing procedures, you must know the accounting. And then the audit procedures will just be trying to find out whether or not the accounting has been done correctly. See? Are we together? In terms of bullet points and I think the question you asked was, suppose you asked to explain to explain the elements of an assurance engagement, state and explain. Okay, I think in explaining, actually you have no choice but to state, which means you are going, the elements, there are 5 elements, you are going to say a crest, if you want to use that mnemonic, crest. C stands for a criteria. In other words, the explanation will be, if you say criteria dash, explanation will be, this will be the basis upon which the financial statements will be compared. In this case, it will be the International Financial Reporting Standards because management are expected to prepare accounts according to that criteria, the International Financial Reporting Standards. Finish, you don't say more, leave a line. then you go to report. This will be the end result of the audit process. At the end of the audit, the auditors will form an opinion and communicate that opinion through the auditor's report. Then he knows you understand that element. Evidence. The auditors will perform audit procedures in order to obtain sufficient, appropriate audit evidence, which will form the basis for the opinion. Again, you have explained. Then the subject matter is the financial statements prepared by management, three-party relationship. You explain the three parties, namely the auditors, the client, and the shareholders. They are the three parties to the assurance engagement. I hope I've answered your question, but if you want to make a follow-up question, please feel free.
Okay, we have another question by Patrick Sanga and Marcus Nazeze. Okay, I think Patrick Sanga has written a question. Is it possible to be asked to identify risk test control and procedures in the same question? Is it possible to be asked to identify risk test controls and procedures in the same question? And then after the presenter has answered this question, Mike Sinazeze, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. We'll proceed like that.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to, in the same question, to be asked to identify and do whatever else? Yes, it is possible. Okay, there are two ways. The examiner may either say this is part 1, in part 1A, Roman numeral 1, you identify and explain. Then in number 2, then you do the other requirement. Or alternatively, they may ask you in the same question, do this and do that. Again, the best format will be the columnar form. What is important is to address all the requirements. For example, in the same question, you may be asked to suggest 3 control objectives, or suggest 3 control activities in a given scenario. And for each control activity, suggest explain the control objective and suggest a suitable test of control in one question. Or they will split it into part A, 1, 2, and 3. But it's exactly the same thing. So what is required is basically to make sure that the presentation is okay. So really it depends on what the examiner would want to do, but it is possible. You can have a multi-requirement question. The advantage of a multi-requirement question, like in this case, it means you know you have to deal with them. You have no choice but to answer them at the same time. Together. And even if they are given as part 1, 2, and 3, you can still show in columnar form, this is my answer to part 1, this is my answer to part 2. And usually in this form of questions, the questions are related. One requires you to explain something, one wants you to demonstrate that you are able to use that thing in answering the other part of the question. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. The way we align the one who addressed the hand, Mike Sinazeze. After Mike Sinazeze, we've got a question by Tizangambi. I think in the interest of time, that will be the last question, and Mwemba. So, Mr. Mike Sinazeze, proceed with your question.
All right. Thank you so much, sir, for your presentation. So I have 2 or 3 questions, but I'll try to be brief. So the first question is, in a scenario that you are given a scenario, and the question is asking you to identify, to explain the benefit of, let's say, an audit committee. My question is, are you still going to find those benefits from the scenario, or you have to draw your knowledge from the text or the manual study book? And also the next question is, how do we, what phrases or what indication which can help the candidate to differentiate between the knowledge question and also those which are answers likely to come from the scenario. And also the third question I've mentioned about free mark, I think from your presentation. I would like to hear more on that, like how do we take advantage of those free mark which you have mentioned in your presentation. Thank you so much.
Right. I hope I got you right to correct on the third one. You said free marks.
Yes, sir. Yes, sure.
Okay. I'm not sure they actually said free as in free, but let's begin with the first one. Suppose the question asks you to explain advantages of the audit committee. Okay. Would you get them from the scenario or you get them from the knowledge in the textbook? Ideally, if the scenario may be basic enough, that actually the idea of the scenario is to help you answer the question. You get the point. It's not meant to confuse you. It helps an average student say, oh, okay, I think there is a benefit of the audit committee here because the composition of the audit committee, for example, has the different skills, and therefore I can pick that and expand it as an advantage. But basically, certain things, the same advantages that are in the manual are the same ones that the examiner is likely to put in the scenario. Save that the scenario is trying to help you actually, to help the student say, look, think about this, think about that, and so on. Now we are together. And all this, the examiner may be, or the examiners will be requiring just to use that information to answer your question. Now we are together. And even if you gave the answers as in the manual, you still get your marks. There's no problem. And actually, that's how come I think I was able to say these are easy marks if you remember the last part of the presentation. Because most of it is basically knowledge-based. To explain something, either you know it or you do not know it, you see. So really, the scenarios are aimed at helping students to be able to say, oh, I think this can help me here, that can help me there, and so on, you see. And we're very together, okay? The next question was, understand? Okay, that was on the audit committee, okay? Knowledge question and the scenario question, okay? With the difference between knowledge-based question and scenario, like we said, if you look at the learning outcomes, I think there is one or two areas where they expect you to identify. That is scenario, obviously. In other words, you can't identify something that you are not given. And so the information will be given in the scenario, and therefore, by implication, they expect you to use that information. Are we together? Whereas if they say, what are the disadvantages of internal control systems? Even if they give you a scenario, it's basically there to help you because the disadvantages are the same. Are we together, colleagues? What are the rights of auditors? I think that's what was a very interesting one in the last exam. What are the rights of auditors? Some of the rights that were given by students were way out, and yet the study manual is very clear. The right to information, the right to this, and so on. They are given, is given by the constitution or whatever legislature and so on. Now we do it together. So really, what is in the scenario is basically meant to make it easier for us. Are we together? But if you are talking about things to do with risk assessment, obviously, it means the risks that you need to explain are those that are in the question. You can't just bring in any risk because the examiner wants to see whether you understand the risk in terms of accounting estimates, for example. So bringing in anything else will not help. The scenario, the ethics, threats to the independence of auditors. Again, you have to use the information in the scenario. Maybe the question is on recruitment. What are the ethical issues where the auditors have been asked to recruit a member of staff, a senior member of staff of the client, or it's on providing non-audit services or preparing financial statements. So you can't bring in any other than what is in the scenario. Are we together, colleagues? So the scenarios really are meant to help you answer the questions, you see. Free marks, I really don't think I said there are free marks, but what it is because this is theory, your explanations are critical. In other words, you imagine if you come up with an answer which maybe the examiner did not think about and it is correct, the examiner will give you marks. Are you getting what I'm trying to say? You will be given marks because unlike accounting or unlike mathematics or statistics, where the answer is 5, here it's about how you explain it. sometimes actually in your explanation, you can entangle yourself and almost force the examiner not to give you full marks, even when you have got an idea. So there is a leeway where the examiners can actually give marks for correct answers, even for correct assumptions. Then you will be able to get those marks. Are we together, colleagues? I don't know whether I've answered your question. I think that's all I can say in that respect. Okay, the next one was what, teaser?
Yes, the next one was teaser. And the question reads, great presentation. Thank you. You mentioned materiality. How do we determine the right benchmark in a case study question? And then the last one by Jivesta Mwemba, kindly comment on the use of some common key requirement words such as evaluate, discuss, etc. What really does the examiner want you to bring out? Thank you. I think this is our last question and we wrap up with the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Materiality is a very important concept in auditing, in the sense that auditors are concerned with material items, okay? And remember, at the end of it all, there's only one opinion that auditors issue, despite doing so much work during an audit. And so, auditors will set or will determine materiality level at the planning stage of the audit. Okay, and it's a matter of professional judgment what figure they will set and say this is the materiality level. It's a matter of professional judgment considering the risks that they've assessed. Are we together, colleagues? In other words, if the auditors conclude that the client is a high-risk client, most likely, in fact, what will happen is the materiality level set will be lower. Will be much lower, which means even for a small misstatement, the auditors will be concerned to dig deep. Okay, but if the audit risk is considered as low, then the materiality level may be set at a high level. I think that's what is most important to understand, the relationship between materiality and risk. In terms of benchmarks, how auditors determine the materiality level, it depends on the information you are given in the particular situation. And auditors may use their percentages given, there's guidance given in our study materials. They may take 1 to 2% of revenue as a starting point to say 1 to 2% of revenue will be our materiality for the financial statements as a whole. Or they may, depending on the risk characteristics of individual sessions, there might be need to compute a materiality level for receivables only. If it has got different risk characteristics, they may compute a different level of materiality. I think what is important is to be able to know the link between materiality and risk. Okay, most likely, and also to know the basis, the benchmarks, 2% of total assets or whatever. You don't even need to memorize those percentages, but show that you understand that is a starting point. We can compute materiality on this basis. Usually, sometimes the examiner will give you total revenue or total assets. And then they just expect you to say, look, I will take materiality as a starting point, 2% of total assets, and do that small computation. And what you are most likely going to get is to be able to also suggest a suitable performance materiality. So there's materiality, and then there's performance materiality, which is the one that you are now going to use in the actual audit. So the auditors may determine a materiality level based on whatever benchmark, but then they want to play it safe. They say, okay, we've computed 5,000 kwacha as the materiality level, but for our audit purposes, we are going to use 3,000 kwacha. And therefore, performance materiality is always lower than materiality computed for the financial statements as a whole. We're together, colleagues. Very, very important. I think that's all you need for the exams. Now, in terms of the following words or requirements, where you're supposed to evaluate, in other words, you are given information and they want you to dig through that information and come up with a conclusion or a recommendation. Limited evaluation, if they say evaluate the internal control system in a particular client, so it means the examiner, you should be able at the end of the evaluation to say whether or not the internal control systems are effective or strong, or they are lacking. And you can only do that by considering the information in the system, in the scenario. then you are evaluating. And there must be a purpose. You must be able to say, out of my evaluation, this is what the situation is. Discuss is much more broad. Discuss. Again, although we are discussing these verbs, they are basically at the higher level, at the advisory level. That's why you'll be expected to discuss, which means you must support your answer. Using the information there in the scenario, depending on what the question is, you need to discuss whether or not this is correct, whether this is appropriate, and be able to conclude. Again, the logic there will matter. How logical is the discussion? How is the conclusion reached related to what has been discussed? You see, are we together? But again, suffice to say, at our level, it's basically explained. The only times we are required to identify or evaluate is basically risky questions, ethical questions, and so on. We're together. If he says discuss the audit opinion, the suggested audit opinion, all he's saying is using the information in the scenario, is this audit opinion suggested appropriate? And therefore, you need to ask yourself, is this matter material? Did the person who suggested this opinion follow through the basic steps? Then you are basically discussing. And your logic must be correct, technically correct. Are we together? With the third thing I will say in closing, as far as I'm concerned, is where students sometimes give wrong answers. Even the wrong answers are technically wrong again. You can't have that. You may give a wrong answer, but it must be technically correct. But to a large extent, some people, by giving wrong answers, they even expose themselves more. They say that actually they don't even know what I didn't ask or what the examiner did not ask. And the only way, colleagues, we can avoid that is through studying. It's through studying. There's no other way. And it's unlikely that people can pass by chance. And they shouldn't pass by chance. Because remember, we are producing a product. The product is you, the graduate, who are going to work in industry and in practice. And so if you are able to slip through without this knowledge, then you take remember, what is that ethical value? The professional behavior. Don't do anything that will discredit Zika or the institute. Because if you are qualified and then you go out there, they ask you a few basic things you can't answer, then it means they will question the qualification, you see. Are we together, colleagues? I think I will end there on that one. Was that the last one? Okay, so for me, before I hand you over to Zika, I want to thank you, those who have attended. I think we initially started with quite a number of people. Do not panic. The examiners or the institute actually has no intentional willingness or deliberate move to fail students. Everyone would want to see students pass, but at the same time, as students, you are expected to demonstrate that you have acquired the skills and competencies that are necessary. Imagine for a moment if pilots would just qualify anyhow, and then there is a pilot who is qualified, flies an aeroplane, goes into the mid-air, and cannot land the aircraft. It will be disaster. It's exactly the same with this. You are expected to do certain things, certain functions after qualifying, and therefore, the only way you can be certified competently is by you demonstrating in the examination. So I wish you well, even as you prepare for the exam. Do not panic. Don't be intimidated by this presentation. Just correct where you think you need to correct, and then you'll be able to pass the exam. I thank you, and therefore I will hand you over to the Zika representative.
We thank you all. And we would like to thank those who have participated in the meeting and wish you all the best. The recording will be shared accordingly. Thank you.